So all the requisites, which were few and hard to come by, were just made locally, either in the monastery or in the village. We use water from a well. They'd dig a deep well down to the water table, and it would be the water. We'd haul it up with what we call a bib, which is like an old kerosene can tied on a rope. We'd haul that up. Once a day we'd meet at 3 p.m. in the afternoon for water hauling chores, and we'd haul the water up and then take it in old jerry cans to the toilets, place where we'd wash our bowls, wash the feet, to the senior monk's kuti and so on. Take about an hour to do the water hauling chores. Then we'd go our separate ways and have our evening bath. There were wells at each corner of the monastery, or some monks could take water back and bathe under their kuti. There's no electricity in those days, so you'd use a candle at your kuti. On the one prat, the day the lay people came in for a talk and to stay and meditate all night, we'd just have one of these oil lanterns with a glass case. It sounds fancy, but it's actually very dim, so you could it was just enough to see your way around the meeting hall. In your kuti you'd use a candle, but there weren't many candles offered, so it wasn't like you could just use as many as you want. You had to use them sparingly, just when you really needed. And you couldn't go and ask anyone for a candle. You just had to make do with what you got. In the rainy season there weren't many umbrellas around. It was up to the store duty monk to distribute what umbrellas were available, and in those days they were paper umbrellas, with wooden spokes and paper glued on. So if you didn't look after it carefully, the rainwater would get to the glue, loosen it, and the whole thing would fall apart and just be finished. So you just had to accept, and if it had fallen apart, if you went back to the duty monk, he might not have anything for you, so you just had to go without. And that was the same with all the requisites. You just had to accept whatever came your way. You couldn't expect to ask for more. So in those days the Senasana was forest Senasana. The dwellings, just very simple forest dwellings, not like today, but they were appropriate for one living with few desires, living in simplicity and seclusion. And I saw it as an opportunity to live in a way where I could be free from the bolipot, the worries and concerns about things like our requisites, our dwellings, relatives and so on. In those days I didn't have any great responsibility yet in the monastery. I was still new. I didn't have to oversee the new training of the new monks, so I had quite a lot of free time to myself to develop my own practice, and I used it for that. We used to get up at 3 a.m, or the morning meeting began at 3 a.m, but I actually used to get there much earlier than that. I didn't feel I needed much sleep or rest or anything special, so as soon as I was ready I would go to the hall to practice. I was always aiming to develop meditation so that I could counter the effects of the 5 hindrances on my mind and develop an awakened state of mindfulness and knowing in each posture. But in the beginning I did emphasize the sitting posture more than the others, to develop the skill of sitting meditation with mindfulness and to develop the endurance which supports this. Always I was developing the mood of one who is in training, one who is practicing. In those days the morning chanting didn't last long, maybe just for 20 minutes. The rest of the time was for meditation. After the chanting we prepared the sala and the eating hall. We wiped it down, swept and wiped it down. Then we would follow the senior monk out on Bindabata. I tended to go to Bangor, which is one of the longer routes, and just took it as part of my meditation, walking meditation. Bindabata was a time to test out one's meditation, to see whether any moods or desires, kilesas, were stirred up. One learned not to think too much whether the route was a long route or a short route, or to think in that way. The main aim was just to maintain mindfulness continuously throughout the Bindabata from beginning to end. Sometimes a novice monk would follow along and ask to receive my bowl, take the bowl for me. Sometimes, because I was new, I wouldn't let them. I just carried my own bowl, tried to be humble. Other times I saw that it might be beneficial for them to do a little bit of a charyawatta, so I allowed them to hold it. When we returned to the eating hall, we collected the food out of our bowls and we separated the different types of food into different vessels. Then when it was time for eat, the monks who were appointed for the duty, they would share out the food walking down the line, placing a share of the food in each of the monks' bowls. And they had to be very careful because there wasn't so much food and they had to make sure everyone got a share. Quite often you didn't get what you wanted. You wanted a certain kind of food, but you just didn't get it, or you didn't get the amount you wanted. But at the same time, you could see this as a chance to practice going against your desires, letting go of the sense of self. On the one prat, the holy day, the Apposita day, the routine was a little bit different from these days. Things were much simpler and the number of people was smaller. We would give the blessing first, then go and receive the food and eat the meal. It's only after the meal that the lay people gathered together to take the precepts and have a talk. Everything was much less formal than today. We would go after the meal back into the hall one more time to listen to Ajahn Chah give the precepts and give a talk. In those days, sometimes people would walk all the way from some of those faraway villages like Bungwai or Kamjala, walk many kilometres to come and stay in the monastery for the day and listen to Dhamma and practice. Some even travelled all the way from Ampa Dade or Ampa Muang because there weren't many branch monasteries in those days. They would come and keep the 8 precepts and stay in the monastery for a day and a night. Everyone listened to the Dhamma talk together, monks and laity, and it probably wouldn't finish till about 10 a.m. After that I would go back to my kuti, and as usual I would do walking meditation while I was digesting my food. Walking posture was probably the best posture for that period of time. Sitting one would tend to be overcome by sleepiness very easily because the stomach was heavy with food and it was hot. I might walk for an hour, then take a rest, perhaps sit for 20 or 30 minutes. Always, whatever the posture, trying to develop mindfulness and let go of any restlessness or agitation in the mind. Not long after that would be the time for the bell for doing the afternoon chores. On the Apposita day, the one prat, we would come out and sweep the entire monastery grounds first together. Then we would do the water hauling to the different places, such as the toilets, and we'd wash down the toilets. In those days there weren't many toilets. There was only 2 toilets for the monks, 2 for the laity, so it's quite easy to look after. In those days the toilets were hidden a long way into the forest. You didn't see them because the sanitation was not so good. Things smelt more in those days. You didn't want the smell and you wanted to keep the toilets private so that they weren't obvious to the public areas of the monastery. I used to take it upon myself to clean the toilets regularly as part of my practice. In those days, people's sense of personal hygiene and so on perhaps was not so developed, so the toilets were often quite messy. I found it was a chance where I could really develop the Asupagamatthana, just practicing, contemplating the repulsiveness of the body, but also to let go of my own personal revulsion to that chore and try to bring my mind to just see the truth of this body and mind, and at the same time do something useful, cleaning up the toilet for the community. So I practiced the Supagamatthana and did the cleaning at the same time. By 4 p.m. On the one prat, we would actually begin our evening sitting meditation. We might have 1 or 2 hour session at that point. The one prat, this holy day, was a time for putting forth effort into the practice, so we would go on the whole night practicing Nesajika, we'd teach ourselves to go against the habit of sleeping and get used to practicing wakefulness right in the middle of the night. After the morning chanting, we would go out on Bindabata into the village. After periods of time where we'd been having regular morning and evening meetings, then occasionally Luang Por would change the routine around. He'd say now is a time for quiet individual practice, and we'd stay at our kutis. But he'd always be reminding us not to congregate in groups and just talk and gossip together. Some of the monks really had to work hard not to do that. They hadn't yet learnt how to be restrained and mindful. Sometimes in those days monks would compete a little bit. There'd be a little bit of rivalry, always asking each other, how long can you sit meditation for? Who can sit up the straightest and for longest, and so on. You might say, well, that's just normal. But it was always also our duty anyway. We had to do this practice. And the main aim was always to develop sati, develop mindfulness, let go of one's worries and concerns about the external conditions, and particularly the difficulties of the external conditions. I didn't actually know much about the other monks. I had come to the monastery, I didn't know anyone before, and I didn't spend much time socializing. I didn't also spend too much time over at Luang Por-Chah's kuti, because I realized he had a burden on it. He had to teach all the newcomers, and I let him get on with it. I didn't want to interfere with that. I respected him, but I also knew I was able to practice on my own, so I used a lot of my private time for the practice. I used to sit up to 2 hours per session, train myself to do that, to sit mindfully as a regular practice. But of course I would practice developing mindfulness in all postures, and always be aiming to counter and abandon any akusala dhammas, unwholesome mental states that arose, and any time the 5 hindrances arose. I practiced watching over my mind the whole time, learning to practice without worries or concerns about the past, the future, and always using Kaya Sati, mindfulness of the body, and particularly Anapanasati as my main object. In the beginning I used the counting of the breaths in pairs, in breath, out breath. Each pair I would count. And I'd also use a candle at night to focus the mind, concentrate the mind on the light of the flame. This would help me to develop a firmer concentration. Or even I would have to use sometimes just the light of the changing light of the day or the night as a way of timing. Because we didn't have a clock, you could know from the light outside what time of day it was. Always we were developing samadhi as a skillful means to bring the mind to stillness, to free the mind from irritation and restlessness, and to develop an awakened state. Gradually over the time, practicing in this way, the experience of the mind started to change into something new. Particularly there was this sense of inner happiness arising, of a kind that I can't really explain in words. And it was an inner happiness that was just present there in the mind, whether standing, sitting, walking, or lying down. It was present all the time. The mind wasn't restless, it wasn't caught into mental proliferation. It was as if I was living on my own all the time, even though I was in the monastery. There were no worries, these balipodi dhammas, the worries about family and relatives, past and future, and the requisites and all these things. When I came out to do the chores or attend the meetings with other bhikkhus, I always felt peaceful and happy in myself. I was satisfied to follow the routine and be there. There was no thought of leaving. I always had this sense of being happy and satisfied with the lifestyle. Even at night, as I came to go to sleep, I would lie down and the body would be as if sleeping, but you could say at the same time the mind was awake. And in the morning when I got up, I would feel refreshed, even though it was as if I hadn't slept. practicing like this, gradually there was a change came over my mind. Sometimes deep states of rapture would arise. The hair would stand up on end, and different experiences of rapture would come up. This was coming from an inner happiness, something you can't really compare with any worldly kind of happiness. It's just one kind of feeling, though, that you become aware of and experience. It wasn't something I attached to or gave a lot of importance to. Sometimes this kind of state might last for 2 or 3 days at a time, but then change again. Maybe it would be replaced by more of a darker mood, where a sense of darkness or suffering or depression might come into the mind. But I always used mindfulness just to quietly know and reflect on such a state, and see what, just as the happiness and the piti, the rapture was one kind of feeling, this is another. I just observed with mindfulness and patient endurance, and could see that these dark states that came, well, they came and then they pass away. Or sometimes it might be sleepiness that was bothering me. In one sense you could say, well, these states are troublesome, but in another sense you could look at them and say, well, there's just nothing to it. It's just an experience arising and passing away. Over time, all these experiences passed away by themselves. Later, another experience arose where there was opasa, like bright, radiant light in the mind, whether the eyes were open or the eyes were closed. This bright, radiant light was there over all the time. But again, it wasn't something I got excited by or attached to as being something special or making me feel as though I'm special. I just reflected on it as another experience and let go of any sense of self that might form around this. I always just kept coming back to the reflection, why am I practicing? What's the purpose of it? And to develop the sense of just being one doing the practice with mindfulness and carefulness. These things might arise in the course of the practice, but we learn not to attach to them. In the end, all that's left is just a feeling of coolness, just the cool mind, the cool body, and a constant experience of wakefulness. It might sound a bit like somebody who's, say, abnormal or crazy, but it's just the natural result of the practice, without an attachment to a sense of self or any kind of conceit. So we always develop this practice of awareness, not getting lost in a sense of self-importance, not letting the kilesa come out in the way we behave, always guarding to prevent suffering from taking over the mind, living simply in this way without attachment. You can't find it anywhere else but in yourself. You have to learn to investigate, observe yourself. Learn to see through that which is covering over that which is the superficial nature of our existence. Learn to see through, penetrate, to see through that. When you're looking at your mind, if you see something is not appropriate, then it implies that there must be something there that's a weakness or at fault. Look at what's arising in your mind. Does your mind get caught into indulgence, intoxication and infatuation? Does it get caught into attraction for different things? We watch these experiences, but without attaching to them as our experiences or as a sense of self. We see them rather as delusions of mind. If we follow them, indulge them, then that will lead to a slowing down in the practice. But if we learn from them, study from them, then they can become something useful. Luang Por Chah taught to eat little, sleep little, speak little. But this is something it's difficult to listen to. If you eat a lot, it tends to encourage a sense of intoxication with food and the idea of food. It becomes an attachment. We become attached to comfort and the feeling of, say, being well fed, and with that, we tend not to see the truth of things. Sometimes the difficulty of eating a little bit less actually helps us to understand and penetrate the truth better. Similarly with sleeping, if we sleep a lot, it tends to slow us down, make us drowsy and heavy, not energetic. If we sleep just the right amount, just enough, that's probably the best for developing a sense of energy and agility in the practice. You might average perhaps 6 hours a day. Think about it, 6 hours is not very long, not many breaths in, breaths out in 6 hours. In just 1 hour it's about 900 in and out breaths on average. When I began practicing, I used the breathing a lot as an object, and I used to count the breath. So 1 in breath, 1 out breath, 2 in breath, 2 out breath, 3 in breath, 3 out breath, 4 in breath, 4 out breath, 5 in breath, 5 out breath. Then I would go back to 1. I'd just go up to 5 to represent the 5 khandhas. I thought that was an appropriate number. When you're sitting, determine how many minutes you're going to sit. So you're going to sit for 40 minutes. Well, stick to that, what you've determined. When you're going to sleep, well, practice sleeping with mindfulness as you're falling asleep. Allow your body to relax, but keep your mind alert until you fall asleep. If you really fall asleep with mindfulness, you might just sleep 2 hours and then you wake up. Maybe you add 2 more hours, that's 4 hours, that should be enough. If you go to sleep with the 5 hindrances in control of the mind, well, you'll tend to find that you don't sleep so well. You don't have mindfulness when you sleep, you don't feel so refreshed, especially if you're drowsy or with the hindrance of sloth and torpor present when you fall asleep. You'll sleep longer and you won't awaken alert. So a good practice to do before you go to sleep is do walking meditation to wake yourself up. Change your posture, wake yourself up, stretch your muscles and nerves, and once you've done this, then go to sleep.